1, 2, 1, 2. Good evening and welcome to the Reverend Martin Darcy S.J. Memorial Lectures. I'd like to especially welcome those joining us online and our collaborators at Georgetown University Press. My name is Gilbrian Stoy. I'm a Holy Cross priest and graduate student here at Campion Hall, and I'm particularly delighted to moderate this evening's lecture because I'm also studying Christian ethics. And one of the aspects that is not well highlighted in the Campion brochure is that Campion functions as a intersection and crossroads for theological academia, and it's become a bit of a bad joke the number of times that I've read some magisterial text and then sat next to that author the following day at lunch. And that has been especially true with Jim Keenan, our lecturer this evening, who's been joining us all of Trinity term. After the lecture, we will have time for questions, so please do prepare those questions, and those who are joining online, enter them into the chat, and we'll have time for dialogue after that. There's an outline available of the talk on the lecture website and also in the chat. And with all of those front matters out of the way, it is my pleasure to welcome Jim Keenan for tonight's third lecture, Preparing for the Moral Life, Recognition. Jim.
Thank you, Gil. Thank you, Gil. I want to begin this lecture on recognition with two meditations. The first, from the poet David Whyte, who connects us with where we were in the last lecture, that is, vulnerability. The second is to investigate the long history of the allegorical understanding of the Good Samaritan parable, so as to see that for Christians, the recognition of the other is always deeply refracted by our recognition of Christ, who redeems us and therefore liberates us for the work of vulnerable recognition and mercy. I discovered David Whyte's poem in Jennifer Lamson Scribner's dissertation on accompaniment and addiction. Here it is in its entirety. I'd have to say Judith Butler would be happy to hear it. Vulnerability is not a weakness, a passing indisposition, or something we can arrange to do without. Vulnerability is not a choice. Vulnerability is the underlying, ever-present, and abiding undercurrent of our natural state. To run from vulnerability is to run from the essence of our nature. The attempt to be invulnerable is the vain attempt to become something we are not, and most especially to close off our understanding of the grief of others. More seriously, in refusing our vulnerability, we refuse the help needed at every turn of our existence and immobilize the essential title and conversational foundations of our identity. To have a temporary, isolated sense of power over all events and circumstances is a lovely, illusionary privilege, and perhaps the prime and most beautifully constructed conceit of being human, and especially of being youthfully human. But it is a privilege that must be surrendered with that same youth, with ill health, with accident, with the loss of loved ones who do not share our untouchable powers. Powers eventually and most emphatically given up as we approach our last breath. The only choice we have as we mature is how we inhabit our vulnerability, how we become larger and more courageous and more compassionate through our intimacy with disappearance. Our choice is to inhabit vulnerability as generous citizens of loss, robustly and fully, or conversely, as misers and complainers, reluctant and fearful, always at the gates of existence, but never bravely and completely attempting to enter, never wanting to risk ourselves, never walking fully through the door. Quite a poem. I think of vulnerability as pre-personal, constituting us as human in God's image. It's helpful to remember that early images of God were more Trinitarian than Christological. The idea that the Trinity is three persons in one God accentuated the person not as autonomous, but as constituted by other persons. Like the triune God, we are human by our being connected to other persons. I will return to this topic of the Trinity in the sixth lecture. Thus, in this project of preparing for the moral life, I am interested today in a theological anthropology that takes seriously not that we are social before we are personal, or personal before we are social, but that we are ontologically connected before we are either. And therefore, the act of recognition will always somehow refract to this underlying prior state of us as connected. Having had many African colleagues and students like Laurenti Magesa, Agabunka Miege Orobator, Johnny Ganser, Benazet Bujo, Azatob Jacquino, Hilary Naiwanya, Leocadi Loshombo, Ann Nasimiu, Veronica Rapp, Ann Atching. Having had these colleagues over the years, I have always been impressed by their insistence that as Ubuntu philosophy teaches us, I am because we are. The interrelatedness of people is not only between being connected among persons and across societies, but also through time, by being connected not only to our ancestors, but to those forthcoming. Vulnerability helps establish the givenness of our connectability. I began these lectures with grief to highlight how profoundly we are connected, such that separation from others is always grievous. On this note, in light of vulnerability, now let us move on to recognition, a recognition that furthers the appreciation of our interconnectedness. As we saw earlier, the parable of the Good Samaritan is an odd one, because in the beginning of the parable, we think the neighbor is the one in need. But at the end, the neighbor is the one who responds. We recognize, too, that the scribe's question at the beginning, who is the neighbor, becomes Jesus' question at the end, with the scribe actually answering his own question. The answer is the Samaritan, because on hearing the story, the Samaritan's enormous responsiveness in mercy to the wounded man eclipses all else. Neighbor is no longer an object to be loved, but a subject to be emulated. Though many do not know this, the parable has been preached through allegory, basically from the early 3rd century through the Reformation. It highlights how significant the agency of the Samaritan is. Let us turn now to that allegorical retelling of the parable. Throughout the tradition, many preachers and theologians saw in the story of the Good Samaritan an allegory in miniature of our redemption by Christ, a story of what Christ has accomplished for us. Starting with Clement of Alexandria, then Origen, Ambrose, and finally Augustine, the Good Samaritan parable was explained by each of them as how mercy was first shown us. Later, from Venerable Bede to Martin Luther, preachers and theologians appropriated and modified the narrative. The basic allegorical expression of the parable was this: the man who lies on the road is Adam, wounded by sin, suffering outside the gates of Eden. The priest and the Levite, the law and the prophets, do not and cannot do anything for Adam. They pass him by. Along comes the Samaritan, Christ, the foreigner, not one from here, who tends to Adam's wounds, our salvation, takes him to the inn, which is the church, makes a down payment toward our redemption, and promises to return for him the second coming, when he will pay in full, now our redemption, and take him with him into his home, the kingdom of God. The parable then is first and foremost not a moral story about how we should treat others. Though often forgotten today, this interpretation of the parable shows us that it is first a narrative of Jesus' redemptive work for us, and then, and only then, a call to go and do likewise. The parable reveals that Jesus was first vulnerable to us when he recognized us on the road. The recognition of Jesus, of us, makes possible our recognition of others. This is a lesson we must never forget, for our capacity to recognize is made possible by his recognition of us first. He recognized how we were wounded by sin and death. He stopped and saved us. In light of that, we need to go and do likewise. So now to recognition. I first came upon the notion of recognition not from a philosopher or a theologian, but from a psychoanalyst and feminist theorist, Jessica Benjamin, who reflected on infancy and mutual recognition among infants. In fact, it was James Hanvey, the former master of Campion Hall, who first pushed me in this direction. Mutual recognition is that central experience of infants among infants. After being the object of the attention of people much bigger than themselves, Mutual recognition is where an infant finally encounters another infant that seems much like itself and yet not. They want to touch the face of another child. They are fascinated that this child in front of them is just like them. They mutually recognize each other. In that moment, they recognize their humanity. They cry when the other cries, smile when the other smiles, touch when the other touches. Benjamin writes, mutual recognition is the most vulnerable point in the process of differentiation. She adds, in mutual recognition, the subject accepts the premise that others are separate, but nonetheless share like feelings and intentions. At first, Benjamin sought to explore ways of restoring mutual recognition as a defining key for understanding right relationship between the genders. In a more recent work in 2017, she turns again to mutual recognition and, among other matters, finds the language of vulnerability key for recuperating and restoring the experience of mutual recognition. As we mature, the experience of mutual recognition can and should happen time and again as part of our growth as moral agents. The mutual recognition in infancy becomes the foundation for subsequent expressions of due recognition whenever we encounter humanity in its greatest precarity or neglect. From that first recognition, where we acknowledge the others and our own humanity, we learn to develop a sense that the other in need is another human being. Of course, as we saw earlier in the biblical stories, overlooking the humanity of another is what gives us the unfortunate permission to withhold due recognition. Thus, the work of education is to help one another to be vulnerable and vigilant enough so that due recognition and appropriate response to the other is actualized as the worthy alternative to the customary but harmful stance of overlooking or neglect. The philosopher, Patty McQueen, provides a foundation for explaining the way recognition unfolds. He proposes it as an insight and a practice that develops, going from first being an awakening to second, making a form of identification, and finally, to acknowledging the other or appreciating the other as such in relation to ourselves. Let me repeat that. Recognition is first an awakening, then makes a form of identification, and finally acknowledges the other as such in relation to ourselves. Do you see the Samaritan here? First awakening to the wounded man, identifying the wounded man as a fellow human, and finally, even in that silence, acknowledging the other's call for help. McQueen expands these steps. He writes, the term recognition has several distinct meanings. First, an act of intellectual apprehension, such as when we recognize we have made a mistake, or we recognize the influence of religion on American politics. Second, a form of identification, such as when we recognize a friend on the street. And third, the act of acknowledging or respecting another being, such as when we recognize someone's status, achievements, or rights. The philosophical and political notion of recognition predominantly refers to the third and is often taken to mean that not only is recognition an important means of valuing or respecting another person, it is also fundamental to understanding ourselves. The move from recognizing someone as familiar to giving recognition to one to whom it is due is, I think, the threshold of the moral life. What we learn in infancy is literally a first lesson. In our vulnerability, we recognize that we are related one to another, that we are not alone, and that the other is not alone. We are awakened to being connected. Then we move from an awakening to a form of identification. We are connected because we are human beings. Later, as children, we realize that the form of identification calls us to a form of responsiveness, especially when the other is neglected, in need, or oppressed. The awakening to and the identification with another's humanity are therefore the first steps toward the threshold wherein, through recognition, we become ethically responsive. I think we need to highlight this point of moving from awakening to identification, the act of acknowledgement, as the threshold of the moral life. For therein, our vulnerability, we, like the Samaritan, recognize the other and begin the process of ethical responsiveness. Three major scholars stay with us as we pause at this threshold of recognition. First, Hilla Haka reflects not on recognizing, but on being recognized. She writes, "It is through recognition, or more precisely, through the experience of being recognized by others, that the self is enabled to keep the tension between sameness and uniqueness, or one's otherness in balance." Then she asks the question, why does recognition matter so much? She highlights the power of recognition when it is given and when it is withheld. She writes, because not only the failure of recognition, but actually the intentional refusal of recognition is possible at any point. Individuals who interact with others are always and necessarily exposed to the risk of being mistreated by others. Individuals are not only dependent on being identified as the same over time, they are dependent on being recognized as equal to others in relevant aspects. In a more recent article, Recognition and Responsibility, Haka seeks to remedy her finding that, quote, while the concept of responsibility is a cornerstone of Christian ethics, recognition theory lacks a thorough theological ethical analysis. Among other matters, she proposes a consideration of the murder of Abel by Cain in Genesis 4, 1 through 16, which she calls, quote, the paradigmatic story of morality, told as part of the narrative of the origins of humans and the history of their faith. She describes the famous narrative in this way, quote, Cain misunderstands God from the beginning, mistaking his own sacrifices as a conditional gift to God for which he expects something in return. God refuses to act accordingly, though God does receive the sacrifice of Abel. Though she does not do it, I think it might be worth our while to linger a moment on the text itself to see how much the text centers on recognition. We are told that the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. Still recognizing Cain's anger, Yahweh warns God, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Nonetheless, Cain does not heed the counsel, but lures his brother out to the fields where he kills him. The text continues. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? I do not think it is without relevance that the Lord does not simply ask, where is Abel, but where is your brother? Cain has destroyed the one human who is without doubt the one closest to and most identified with him. When Cain is punished to be a restless wanderer, Cain responds in terror. My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. But the Lord responds, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. The Lord not only assures Cain that he will not be hidden from the Lord, but that he will be recognized by the Lord and by all others. Haka comments on the passage. The story depicts Cain's desire to be recognized by God, spelling out the tragic consequences of misunderstanding God's love and demands. Cain becomes as much the symbol of the desire for recognition as for the failure of responsibility. Being marked and put under God's protection in one symbol, Cain survives the moral failure, just as the people of God survive all following failures and mistakes, despite all the catastrophes that pile up over the course of history. I will return shortly to the question about recognizing one's brother. But before I move to the second scholar on recognition, let me acknowledge how it is through contrast, through what Hacker calls misrecognition, that we see the true power of recognition. Invariably, the failure to appreciate the significance of identification leads to the failure to acknowledge, and the failure to cross that threshold leads to moral failure. The second scholar is the German philosopher Axel Honneth, whose 1995 work, The Struggle for Recognition, The Moral Grammar of Social Conflicts, is a foundational exposition on the urgency of recognition for the moral life. Honneth posits a social philosophy that undergirds the personal understanding of the good life, which he describes as the process of realizing without coercion one's self-chosen life goals. Honneth argues that recognition plays a constitutive role in the attainment of these goals. Positively, recognition supports the agent's pursuit of agency that requires self-trust and the ability to name, set, and realize one's goals. As Bart van Leeuwen notes, what characterizes the intersubjective character of Honneth's theory is that this positive self-relation becomes possible only through patterns of recognition. Hence, these represent the intersubjective conditions that we must presuppose in order to describe the general structures of the good life. Just as we saw the ontological priority of vulnerability as a condition for our moral responsiveness, Honneth sees these intersubjective conditions as foundational for the pursuit of the moral life. Negatively, then, the social failure to recognize, the social refusal to recognize, or the actual stance of social disrespect compromises the other's, quote, potential to exercise his own freedom in order to realize those values that he deems to be constitutive of his own personality. The human needs recognition to flourish. Famously, Honneth argues the reproduction of social life is governed by the imperative of mutual recognition, because one can develop a practical relation to self only when one has learned to view oneself from the normative perspective of one's partners in interaction as their social addressee, so as to further the realization of the imperative of mutual recognition. Honneth invokes the common good, the topic of the Campion lectures last year by Patrick Reardon. The common good, Honneth notes, puts everyone in the same position to understand his or her value for the community without restricting the autonomous realization of his or herself. In this kind of society, subjects with equal rights could mutually recognize their individual particularity by contributing in their own ways to the reproduction of the community's identity. As we can see, for Honneth, mutual recognition provides the constitutive foundation for the personal and social realization of the good life, the moral life. Following then on this theme of contrast in both Hacker and Honneth, we turn now to Butler and return to her concept of grievability that we saw at the conclusion of the second lecture. In a way that reflects Honneth's own concerns, Butler frames her concept in this way: the most individual question of morality, how do I live this life that is mine, is bound up with biopolitical questions distilled in forms such as these: whose lives matter, whose lives do not matter as lives, are not recognizable as living, or count only ambiguously as alive. Butler directs us then to her question: whose lives are grievable and whose are not? In order to help you to appreciate the question, I want to share with you how the question affects my reading now of the morning newspapers. I remember well, now with shame and guilt, that before learning this concept of grievability and before the emergence of Black Lives Matter through the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, that when I read the newspaper, some stories of tragedy caught my eye, my recognition, and prompted me to read their story, see what happened, reflected on it, and considered their loss, even engaging in some empathy. I attended, if you will, to their tragedy. But there were others that I did not pause to read. As I say, I do this with shame and guilt. That I thought to myself, oh, yet again, another person shot by police, or another homeless person found dead. I exercised an economy with my time and realized that I was stopping at those who were grievable in my estimation and simply considered the others as not. Invariably, in many instances, the stories I did not read were stories of Black men. The notion of grievability serves as a new examen for me. I stop and read now and take in accounts that I formerly wrongfully overlooked. It prompts me to an awareness of white supremacy in the US, in myself, and in why I need to expose it. Butler talks about how we individually and collectively live out the matter of grievability in powerful and prophetic terms. She writes, the biopolitical management of the ungrievable proves crucial to approaching the question, how do I lead this life? Terrifyingly, Butler reflects on the person who understands themselves as not grievable. She notes, quote, this question becomes most acute for someone, anyone, who already understands him or herself to be a dispensable sort of being, one who registers at an affective and corporeal level that his or her life is not worth safeguarding, protecting, and valuing. She adds, if it turns out that I have no certainty that I will have food or shelter, or that no social network or institution would catch me if I fall, then I could come to belong to the ungrievable. Powerfully, Butler sums up her argument about how social structures effectively make the determination of the ungrievable. She writes, this is a long paragraph, the reason that someone will not be grieved for or have already been established as one who is not to be grieved for is that there is no present structure of support that will sustain that life, which implies that it is devalued, not worth supporting and protecting as a life by dominant schemes of value. The very future of my life depends upon that condition of support. So if I'm not supported, then my life is established as tenuous, precarious, and in that sense, not worthy to be protected from injury or loss, and so not grievable. If only a grievable life can be valued and valued through time, then only a grievable life will be eligible for social and economic support, housing, healthcare, employment, rights of political expression, forms of social recognition, and the conditions for political agency. One must, as it were, be grievable before one is lost, before any question of being neglected or abandoned, and one must be able to live a life knowing that the loss of this life that I am would be mourned. And so every measure will be taken to forestall this loss. I think Butler's concept of the social demarcation of those whose lives are grievable and those whose lives are not helps us to realize the impact of mutual recognition. Before we move on to the question of social structures that make these determinations, I wish to offer 3 brief meditations on the misrecognized or the ungrievable. The first is the actual public murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, on the streets of Minneapolis by a police officer. The fact that Mr. Floyd was publicly killed by a police officer with other officers assisting over the period of 8 minutes and 46 seconds of having a knee pressed down on his throat as he died uttering, "I can't breathe," provided the social instruction to kneel in grief for the same 8 minutes and 46 seconds as a counter practice, not only to that, but to the festivities that celebrated in years past in my country the lynching of Black men, women, and children. That history of lynching was finally recognized only in 2015 when the Equal Justice Initiative released a study that detailed over 4,400 documented racial terror lynchings of Black people in America between 1877 and 1950. In June 2020, Equal Justice Initiative, during the 12-year period of Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, in other words, the 12 years prior to the period that they previously studied, at least another 2,000 Black women, men, and children were victims of racial terror lynchings. Not only were these deaths not grieved, their murders were horrendously celebrated with white men, white women, and white children participating. You can see the postcards that they sent of these lynchings, where children, women, and men, all white, gather at a hung body of a Black person. Now, against that social culture, the Black Lives Matter movement insisted that white culture be taught how to grieve the death of George Floyd by kneeling for these 8 minutes and 46 seconds, by uttering, "I can't breathe," and by remembering the name of George Floyd and all those others murdered in the United States. Black Lives Matter is a way of forcing American white people to acknowledge that George Floyd mattered, that he was and is grievable, as were Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. It calls us to remember their names, their lives, and their deaths as grievable. Black Lives Matter prompts us to recognize how these people died and how, until this moment, we could simply overlook these killings and not take note. Black Lives Matter is a social movement summoning white America to a mutual recognition of Black America. A second meditation goes to a film called Elephant Man. This David Lynch film came out in 1980 while I was a student at Weston Jesuit School of Theology, learning moral theology for the first time. The climax of this social drama on the life of the severely deformed Joseph Merrick, whose own head he normally hooded, comes when Merrick, unhooded, is hunted down by a crowd that pursues him into a men's public bathroom where, in the midst of urinals, this man, who's so ungrievable, cries out in protest, "I am not an elephant. I am not an animal. I am a human being. I am a man," as he collapses amidst the row of urinals. I cannot remember a more striking summons to mutual recognition in film. The third meditation leads me to return to the Prodigal Son Parable to uncover recognition's rich relationship with both the vulnerable and the familiar. In the parable, as the vulnerable father attends to the prodigal, he remains vulnerable to his older son as well. As we saw in the previous lecture, the father knows that his movement toward the prodigal will surely trigger the older son's insecurities. He's not surprised by the resentment. He knows it will express itself. The stability in the story is this vulnerable father, as the precarious son returns and the resentful one tries to leave. Indeed, the father's response to the older brother is extraordinary. As biblical theologian Greg Forbes notes, the father again acts contrary to all expectations. If a son talked to his father, as the son does in this parable, Forbes notes, he observes that in this situation, a Middle East father would lock the son up, finish the banquet, and then have the son beaten. Instead, the father's patience with the angry older son is not unlike Yahweh's warning the resentful Cain. In both instances, the older son needs to recognize his brother. So when the older son refers to his prodigal brother as that son of yours, the father urges him to recognize that this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. Still, the brother needs to be vulnerable before he will recognize. Without it, due recognition just does not happen. In many ways, the older brother in the prodigal is a replay of Cain, unable to return to the original mutual recognition of himself discovering Abel. Finally, correcting the socially directed gaze, the call to recognition. Why is it that our cultures, like the biblical ones, let people fail to recognize their neighbor in need and even to socially disrespect them? I would like to take you to 3 works that attempt to redirect this gaze, our gaze. The question of cultures insulating us from the need to recognize our neighbor was raised in the United States nearly 90 years ago by one of the most famous Protestant American ethicists, Reinhold Niebuhr. In 1932, he warned ethicists that they lacked, quote, an understanding of the brutal character of the behavior of all human collectives and the power of self-interest and collective egoism in all intergroup relations. It's quite a sentence. There, in Moral Man and Immoral Society, a study in ethics and politics, he insisted that we do not see, quote, the limitations of the human imagination, the easy subservience of reason to prejudice and passion, and the consequent persistence of irrational egoism, particularly in group behavior. In many ways, we go on teaching today, nearly 90 years later, failing to heed the forces that empower, quote, the inequalities of privilege that are greater than could possibly be defended rationally. It is in the interests of such forces that we continue to fail to recognize those whose inequities pay the price of our privilege. No wonder that we rarely recognize. No wonder how we each unreflectively distinguish the grievable from the ungrievable by the read of a morning newspaper. And yet reason is often invoked precisely to defend such inequalities of privilege and thus keep us from giving due recognition. In her stunning critique of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, Kate Ward describes how Smith aimed to create a social culture that could tolerate and even promote his economic theory. She laid bare Smith's contempt for, and this is a quote of Smith's, those whining and melancholy moralists who call attention to the suffering of distant others, end quote. Noting how he considered the moralist sympathy for those misfortunes, quote, absurd and unreasonable and irresistibly unnatural. The father of capitalism understood well the importance of keeping our gaze from those who are victims of our privileged structures. I remember the first time I taught the theory of moral sentiments. I was so astonished at how Smith directed the gaze of sympathy upward to the so-called self-made man. That upward gaze of Smith's sympathy never caught a glimpse of the homeless person or some other in need. When Ward submitted her publication for essay that dissected moral sentiments, and in particular, the device of the so-called impartial spectator, that is, capitalist, and revealed the senior scholars who acquiesced in the Smith agenda. She named all these different authors that praised Smith for his sensitivity to the poor and others, without noticing what he had actually written. She received, of course, numerous rejection notices until finally Heathrop Journal published it in 2015. In many ways, the journal's rejections were an institutional resistance to her insistence that the moral sentiments were, well, false. The title of Ward's essay, a quote from Smith, "Mere poverty excites little compassion." Adam Smith, Moral Judgment and the Poor, conveys how effectively Smith validates our daily disinterest in compassion for those in need. I recommend it for those who especially think otherwise. Finally, we turn to Isabel Wilkerson and her magnificent cast, The Origins of Our Discontent, which argues that America's racism is a caste system. Throughout, she provokes the reader to see how our society keeps us from seeing the structures that frame American racism. Now, I'm talking about American racism throughout this paper, not because this is the singular act. It's what I am a part of, my culture. Those of you who are in India, those of you in Nigeria, those of you here in England, those of you in other parts of the world, you have your structures. Mine are thankfully becoming more apparent. But I open this up for a way of self-examination as an invitation for others to think similarly. Throughout, she provokes the reader to see how society keeps us from seeing the structures that frame American racism. To awaken us from our compliance with these structures, she proposes the image of a wordless usher whose flashlight helps keep our gaze focused, not letting our eyes avert to any recognition that caste itself is guiding us to look only at what caste wants us to recognize. She writes, "As we go about our daily lives, caste is the wordless usher in a darkened theater, flashlight cast down in the aisles, guiding us to our assigned seats for a performance. The hierarchy of caste is not about feeling or morality. It's about power, which groups have it and which do not. It is about resources, about which caste is seen as worthy of them and which are not, about which gets to acquire and control them and who does not. It is about respect, authority, and assumptions of competence. Who is accorded these and who is not?" Wilkerson defines caste as, quote, "the granting or withholding of respect, status, honor, attention, privileges, resources, benefit of the doubt, and human kindness to someone on the basis of their perceived rank or standing in the hierarchy. In short, discerning the grievable from the ungrievable." Early in her work, she explains how caste can help us understand how race is structured in my country. Caste is the infrastructure of our divisions, she writes. It is the architecture of human hierarchy, the subconscious code of instructions for maintaining, in our case, a 400-year-old social order. Looking at caste is like holding the country's X-ray up to the light. Nicely, she sums up the way they correlate. Race in the United States is the visible agent of the unseen force of caste. Caste is the bones, race is the skin. Before highlighting the affinities with India's caste and Germany's Nazi history, she invites us to consider how early caste was formed. The arrival of the slave ships in 1619 helps us to see that, quote, "before there was a United States of America, there was a caste system, born in colonial Virginia. Against the blackness of the American slave, the general white population was hardening into a single caste. The impact of slavery was not simply a dark chapter in the country's history, nor was it, quote, merely an unfortunate thing that happened to Black people. Rather, slavery, she writes, was an American innovation, an American institution created by and for the elites of the dominant caste and enforced by poorer members of the dominant caste. That's key, enforced by poorer members of the dominant caste. Its impact was ferocious. Quote, the vast majority of African Americans who lived in this land in the first 246 years of what is now the United States lived under terror, the terror of people who had absolute power over their bodies and their very breath, subject to people who face no sanction for any atrocity they could conjure. She added, slavery so perverted the balance of power that it made the degradation of the subordinate caste seem normal and righteous. Whiteness developed for the sake of caste. Europeans, before coming to America, were Italian, German, French, English, Serbs, Swedes, and Russians. When they arrived in America, they became identified as white and were fused together solely to strengthen the dominant caste and hierarchy. As white, they learned that hostility toward the lowest caste became part of the initiation rite into citizenship. Through caste, immigrants became white supremacists. Wilkerson notes that caste is, she writes, not necessarily personal. Rather, caste is constituted by, quote, patterns of social order that have been in place for so long that it looks like the natural order of things. In a word, in the United States, caste is familiar. Quote, the investment in keeping the hierarchy as it is in order to maintain your own ranking, advantage, privilege, or to keep yourself above others or keep others beneath you. The power of these arguments by Niebuhr, Ward, and Wilkerson is that they remind us how prevalent the forces are that keep us from reverting our gaze and discovering a mutual recognition in the other, whose conditions we are socially trained to ignore. Recognition is therefore that act that liberates the vulnerability of both the agent and the other in the face of the distorting power of the caste or social systems that structure our lives. But recognition is not simply a personal act. As Hocker and Honeth noted, by misrecognition or disrespect, we see those who are not recognized, and generally they are not individuals, but collectives, organized by race, tribe, ethnicity, class, caste, gender, sexual orientation, etc. Similarly for Butler, too, the ungrievable are not preeminently singular persons, but again, collectives. Social structures, like those created by capitalism or by a slave market, help to manage us, and in particular to distinguish those who count as recognizable or grievable and those who do not. For the most part, though, I began the last lecture with very much the personal as vulnerable, through leading us always to see the vulnerable as prior to personhood or social identity. Now, in concluding this lecture, we see recognition as very much having social impact. We must not think, however, that these structures have agency, as critical realists remind us. These ethicists like Daniel Finn, Dan Daly, Connor Kelly, and others help us to see that human persons are agents and that their collectives have agency, but social structures do not. Social structures influence us tremendously, though we remain moral agents. This governing insight of theirs rescues us from misplacing our moral freedom and responsibility. Critical realists want us to attend to these structures, to see that we can redirect them, correct them, dismantle them, and rebuild them. We need to see how very much they may, like the wordless usher, try to direct us, but whether we follow or not is for us to decide. Critical realist social theory is a significant platform that helps us today to better appreciate the influence of those forces. The finest explication of the theory that I've seen is the critical realist solution to the structure agency problem chapter found in Dan Daly's book, The Structures of Virtue and Vice. There, Daly notes, quote, the critical realist approach presents an account of structures and agency that make space for both realities. He adds, structures enable persons to act in prescribed ways and constrain them from acting otherwise. In short, the possibilities of human action occur within a social context. Critical realism maintains that though agents are free, structures provide pathways to certain kinds of lives and actions. Structures do not determine actions, rather structures enable and constrain action. Because critical realist thought maintains that there is ontological distance between structures and persons, it preserves space for the person to conduct an internal conversation regarding what should she do given the circumstances. The key here, undoubtedly, is the importance of recognition, not only to acknowledge those who are not grieved or disrespected, but to see the structures that persuade us to not think otherwise. When we recognize that George Floyd matters or that Black Lives Matter, we are not only according the due recognition to the too long wrongly ungrievable, we also need to recognize the social forces that validated the previous stance. Recognition of the ungrievable can be and should be at the same time an awakening to the forces that lulled us into our original diverted gaze. We need to cultivate the virtue of vigilance that prompts us to recognize more often, more clearly, and more universally. With humility as the foundation for our vulnerability, we can cultivate the virtue of vigilance so as to generate a readiness to see the world as it actually is, a mindfulness that we not become as preoccupied as the priest and the Levite in the Good Samaritan parable, but rather that we are prompt to recognize and respond to the neighbor in need. But first, we need to recognize, as Niebuhr and Wilkerson argue, that our gaze is constantly being diverted. Thus, this new vigilance invites us to investigate ourselves as to whether we see the world as it really is in the first place. I suggest that we start by recognizing that we were once redeemed by the one who stopped along the way and recognized us as wounded. Then maybe by starting there, we too might begin to go and do likewise. Thank you. So we're very happy here to take questions. I have the master of Campion Hall sitting in front of me, so that if you don't ask me a question, I'm sure he will. But I'm opening this up for questions that Gil is going to see, remedy, capture those online or those here.
I wonder if I might be able to start out. Jim, first off, thanks so much for a really powerful reflection on these preconditions for moral life. I'm wondering, especially thinking about the priest and the Levite from the passage, it strikes me that they not only walk by, but they actually walk to the other side of the road.
Yeah.
And thinking about that, and thinking about the passage from Adam Smith where you talk about where he describes the suffering of distant others. I'm wondering about this question about distance, and it seems like there's this encounter that's a requisite. And I wonder if does that encounter happen prior to this process of recognition?
Yeah.
Or is that an aspect maybe of awakening? How might that encounter, the way in which society tries to avoid that encounter, fit
Great.
into this?
Thank you, Gil. It strikes me that we need space so that we're not prompted to recognize. I mean, we don't like to be bothered with that. Think of the newspaper. Think of how we watch news now. I remember as a kid growing up in the United States, Walter Cronkite, he gave us the good, the bad, and the ugly. He was not pandering to us. He was actually just trying to give us the news. Now the news is what we want to hear. And we listen and have our own biases reaffirmed time and time again by the news. We sit in front of the TV of those news programs that do that. Why? Because we want to have our gaze, our world affirmed. And we don't want to be bothered by having to recognize some other data. So I think what we're always doing is looking for the space to be comfortable in our skin, which I'd like to use that word, our skin, to say that it's usually collectives. which is why we often turn to one another and say things of how we accommodate ourselves in the worlds we live in by saying, I don't read that newspaper, do you? We're looking for the confirmation that these ways of us managing to manage the possibility of recognition is not happening. I mean, this is the work of education. How do you provide to young people that they recognize what is not being allowed to be filtered through? I mean, I think that is really rather critical. I remember years ago when Gaddafi in Libya had some antagonistic relations with the United States, and the United States bombed a place that was a factory, was called a factory for making dietary products for infants, when as a matter of fact, it was a hospital. However, in the United States, it was reported that it was a factory and not that. And I was living in Rome at the time, and I could see what nobody else in the States was seeing because I was living in Italy and they were showing these things. And then the next day or a few days later, around that time, Gaddafi tossed the missiles at Lampedusa. And in Rome and in my Jesuit community, I was no longer a likable person. I thought I was. I think they think that, but they needed to express how they felt, and they needed to distance me as being now too contemptuous to be there. And I walked into the dining room and people stood up and booed me as I walked in. And they knew that I had no interest in supporting this policy of what we had done, but they needed to collectively acquit themselves of any contact with what we were doing. Though several weeks later, when things calmed down, they would say to me things like, you should have killed him. There's a certain way that the collective, when it works, does need to do a lot of moving about. There's a lot of animation, but there's not a lot of real study in terms of ethics. I mean, it's really important, this thing. Reinhold Niebuhr was here giving lectures here when he was trying to let people know that social forces keep us from doing the right. That was, 1932. We still do not appropriate that. It's still not part, that suspicion that we are being governed and directed, and that Big Brother is actually not watching us, but actually helping us to watch what we want. That's the space that we've created. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Jim. I recently read something on willful blindness, which claimed that this is a relatively recent discovery. The author obviously hadn't read the older Christian moral tradition and the idea of culpable ignorance. But what you're saying here seems to be that this willful blindness, this culpable ignorance, this failure to recognize the other, has a profoundly social dimension as well as a kind of interior dimension. So how would you explain that social dimension to culpable ignorance, willful blindness?
Yeah, I think that most people acquit themselves from not knowing reality as it is. I didn't know. But I always think there's a passage in Thomas Aquinas that he writes in the 13th century. It's he asks these two questions. He asks, do you always have to follow your conscience? This is question 19.5, Article 5 of the Prima Secundae. He says in this question, do you always have to follow your conscience? He uses the word ratio, reason. I'm not going to go down that alley, but he's basically saying a dictate of reason, telling you that this is the way you're to act. And he says, do you always have to follow your conscience? And he says, always. But then in the next question, in Article 6, he says, What happens if you followed your conscience and it was wrong? Are you still considered wrong or right? Are you good or bad, basically, is what he's asking. And he says, if you could have known, you had a duty to know it. And he puts everything into this phrase, could have known. This is 1906. I think this is the key to the question that we have here. What he does is really interesting. Before him, Abelard and Bernard of Clairvaux had this big argument. Abelard said that if you follow your conscience, you're right or good. And Bernard says that if you follow an erroneous conscience, you're bad. Thomas flips this and says, if you don't follow your conscience, you're wrong. But it doesn't mean necessarily that you're good if you ended up doing something wrong. And he says, if you could have known. This could have known is, I think, the key to this question. Could we have known? Like, why is it that it took me so long to recognize that Black lives, men, were being shot in the streets? And we always saw these reports of Black men being killed by police. How is it that I didn't know that this was something I should attend to? How many things are there in our own societies that we could have known that we don't bother to know? Think of sexual abuse in the church and the question of what could have been known and wasn't. And there was a certain way of resisting knowing or finding out. Think of yourselves, of how many times you find yourself basically tempted to finding out something and saying, no, I think I'm going to let matters be. And that may be a very right prudential choice. But what I'm really interested in is more the social factors that inhibit us from seeing what needs to be known, what needs to be known. 60 million people are on the move right now in our world as refugees. 60 million people. Now, it strikes me that that's a fact that we need to know and that we need to teach and that we need to raise up. But how much, as Eliot would ask, reality do we really stand up to? Frank? Oh, sorry.
I think maybe another factor is even longer established is the whole structure of the way history is taught. I lived in West Africa from the ages of 21 to 23. I had never heard of the Gold Wars, which Britain fought at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. There was not a whisper in our school textbooks of the Gold Wars, which included burning down a wooden town and shooting all those who fled from the town. This was not in the school histories.
Right.
And so it's what another theologian who taught me called selective amnesia on a vast scale.
Yeah, I mean, the point of Kate Ward writing this essay, she's reading Moral Sentiments. He does not have anything but disdain for those who are poor. He ridicules them. He actually tells you that sympathy is to be directed toward the self-made man. That's happening. She simply wants to say that all these ethicists are trying to validate Smith by saying that he had sympathy for people, and she's saying in her text that you're wrong. Not only that, you wrote this and you upheld this myth the entire way. So I use that as an example, just a simple example of how in the academy, for instance, and you're giving another example, things are filtered or not, and that the need for a right education is really problematic. We watch right now in the States, I see these discussions about what books will be taught and what books will be not. This is really this bigger question. My issue about recognition is that this is an enormous issue, that as a matter of fact, the way that we are persuaded by our social structures to not look at certain areas and not look in certain ways is sustainable. and that we have to look at the sustainability of these projects to be able to critically examine them. We see, for instance, in yesterday's New York Times, that the distribution of the COVID vaccination will be like what we've seen about the access to HIV/AIDS medications, that the pandemic of AIDS is going to be repeated in the pandemic of COVID. That's an insight. That's a little opening, a little glimpse of how capitalistic our structures of healthcare are, that as a matter of fact see as ungrievable those who do not have access to COVID vaccines are the same who did not have access to HIV/AIDS. These structures of ungrievableness that we have, I think, are things that we need to raise up. I think it would be nice if our churches did that. It would be nice if our bishops did that. If our bishops want to find out what they can do, they could somehow help us to see what and who need to be grieved and who are not being grieved. For indeed, there is a certain way that it's a luxury that we do not grieve those who are actually grieving themselves now.
Do you know if we have a question from online? One viewer asked, was George Floyd's desperate call for his mother at the last moments a call to one who would recognize him? Is there something we can draw from that?
Yeah, I mean, we have to also remember that as he's dying, there are people around there. Now, of course, they're not able to do much because, as a matter of fact, there are other police officers there. But that is what's happening. They're filming it. They're taking pictures of it. They're witnessing it. In one sense, they may be witnessing it out of justice. And others, they may be witnessing out of curiosity, as opposed to some sort of sense of respect for what horrendous action is happening. But I think that that's why people, I think that the narrative about the mother is a way of just trying to make him, George Floyd, more of a human being and not ungrievable. There have to be ways that we build the bridges to make the recognition possible. I find for myself on Black Lives Matter, my colleagues, I have some great colleagues. Sean Copeland, I can think of any number of times where she would call me out and tell me I had to do something on matters of racism. Or Brian Massingale, who did the same with me on any number of occasions, who's now the president of the Society of Christian Ethics, and we worked together a great deal. In fact, I'm going to be on a Zoom call with him at 8 o'clock tonight. But these people have helped me to see my blindness. We can't think that we're the ones who are going to correct this. The ones who will correct this are the ones who are the victims of the structure. The Equal Justice Initiative of 2015 to talk about the lynchings came from Black people. No, not white people, Black people. Brian Stevenson launched this. But it is their graciousness in reaching out to us, telling us that we need to see what is reality that is important. So it's not like we're in Plato's cave, that we don't know we're in Plato's cave. We have colleagues, friends, who are trying to tell us that we need to see what's beyond the door, or beyond like your space on the other side of the road. And I think that we need to have this vigilance, especially of those who see things that we do not yet see.
I have a question about the legitimacy of non-recognition. And I make an example. In Italy, after the Second World War, the neo-fascist party was excluded from the political scene. And the other parties would say, we cannot talk with you. we cannot recognize you as a legitimate interlocutor because of what happened during the Second World War. And I think that in other cases in contemporary society, we have this kind of non-recognition, the opponent, the other person, the other party, the other society is so unworthy, considered so unworthy that he or she cannot be considered as a part. We can't recognize them. Is that legitimating some, well, in that case, for Italy, it was a very strong case, and so fascism was abolished. There was not the right to create a new fascist party. But what can you tell about that?
So I think this is a great question, and I'm going to do a shout out to another one of my doctoral students. I like doing that. I have one student right now who's working on caste and recognition, and he's from Chennai. His name is Dinakaran. But who I'm thinking of is Hilary Naiwanya, who is from Nigeria, and gave a paper in Rwanda, and it was on recognition. And he's the first who prompted me to pay attention to recognition. And he was invited to Rwanda to a conference on the genocide. And he argued that the recognition that was going on in the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of Rwanda were always noticing the victims. But he wanted to note, what about those who actually gave an account of themselves and underwent reform and punishment? What about recognition of them who've repented and are trying to re-enter society, or are they ignored? So I think that this is a key question that people who are looking at recognition realize that the misrecognition is not a help. Now, of course, what Naiwanya is interested in doing is saying, what constitutes a valid recognition of perpetrators of atrocities? And how can they be reincorporated into society? This is a similar question of people who have been accused of sexual abuse, who are not, if you will, psychopathically incurable, but rather who have done something wrong, have acknowledged it, have reformed their lives, but are not recognized as such. This question of recognition is to be played out in all the different forms by which we hold back that recognition. I think what Honeth helps us to see is how problematic misrecognition is, and how problematic the failure to recognize is, whether it's in an instance like this of Italian fascists, whether it's involved in Rwanda with some tribes, whether it's in some other context. So yeah, great question. And it's a question, though, that's coming from people who are doing doctoral studies. You're looking now at these emergent issues of recognition, and you're seeing where we need to go further. Like your question about seeing the space and the distance, we're now looking more perceptively at how recognition and misrecognition are vices and virtues that we need to more socially acknowledge. So great question. Hilary will be very happy. Hi, Hilary, of this notice.
Excellent, and that was perfect timing as well. We have come to the end of our time together, and all that's left is to invite everyone to join us again next week for part 4 on conscience. Once again, thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you, Gil. Thank you.